This is the South African Morning. Thank you for joining us right here on eNCA 403. We bring you this now where funding remains a challenge for many students in the country. And this has led to protests, including campus shutdowns earlier on this year. Now the students were calling on government to abolish historical debt and to allow pupils who owe institutions to register. Now, Higher Education Minister Blade Nzimande says a task team will be established to address the student funding challenge. But what else can be done to solve this, which is an ongoing issue? To discuss this further, we're joined by Professor Francis Petersen from the University of the Free State. Prof, good to have you this morning. Thank you so much for your time. We'll get into, your recommendations in just a moment. But in your view, where has government gotten it wrong in terms of raising funding as well as other resources for students?
Good morning, Tumelo, and good morning to the viewers. I believe that government initial focus of providing funding to students in higher education is a good commitment. I think where it actually have gone wrong is the system how to do that. We have established the National Student Financial Aid System, NSFAS. And this was initially started off as just a bursary and a loan scheme, and then now it only is a bursary scheme up to households up to about 350,000 rand income. And the challenge with the system that it is at the moment is that it's a bursary scheme. The money is being allocated to the students. The money has to come from government. Every year there is either a potential increase due to the cost of living, or there's an increase of numbers of students. And therefore, there's always going to be a growth in the allocation from government to NSFAS. But there isn't a flow of money back into the system. And such a system is not sustainable at all. Yeah. And that for me is the crux of the matter, Tumelo.
All right, let's talk about then this student resource system that perhaps you think is the answer here. How do you think we can resolve this? Because as we're talking right now, surely there should be a student out there who is at home, can't access education because of this issue of funding.
Yeah. So what I'm suggesting in this specific opinion piece is not actually something new, but it's something that never has been implemented. In 2015, 2016, we had the Hare Commission. In the Hare Commission, one of the recommendation, or in fact, I would say the recommendation that came out of that was the establishment of an income contingent loan, and that income contingent loan is where the student, as soon as the student exit the system, so the money would be made available in terms of a loan scheme, and as soon as the student exit the system and enter the economy and starts to work, and if that student meet a minimum threshold of income, that student then start to pay back that loan, and that student will also be registered through the South African revenue system, revenue services, and therefore it's actually quite easy to collect that funding through SARS back into the loan scheme. Now that recommendation was never implemented, and I believe that we should go back to that recommendation, try to understand it. But there's something that I introduced in this opinion piece, myself and my co-author, Professor Philippe Berger, was to say, well, there need to be a private-public partnership here. We know what the pressure is on government, what the pressure is on the fiscus, and therefore we need to understand that the value of higher education is not only accrued to the public, it's also to the private sector. There's also beneficiaries there. And to what extent can we establish a public-private sector relationship to fund such a loan scheme, and also use the experience that the private sector has, such for instance commercial banks, to be able to run such loan schemes. And that really is, I think, what we should pursue to be able to get to a sustainable challenge, a sustainable solution.
I mean, the amount of unemployed graduates in South Africa, it just raises alarming, questions and concerns. And when you're talking about the private sector, it means that at some point, I think, Prof, the private sector needs to be lenient in terms of their entry-level requirements. So for graduates that are into, the job market, are looking for employment, however, private sector is still looking for 3-5 years experience. I mean, surely there has to be a give and take here when you talk about that private and public relationships, but I suppose private sector may say, hey, we want some certain incentives if we are to sort of build a sustainable relationship here.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. I think, first of all, in terms of the loan scheme, the private sector, and specifically the banks, need to look at their risk a little bit differently. And I think that is one area, and one can elaborate on that, how one can do that. At the moment, I think the way in which they manage risk is a little bit too stringent in a way. But government also need to come in to be able to say, well, how do we underwrite some of those things? So that's the one part. The employability part, private sector will always would always argue what's the value for me, and therefore from the skill, as you have indicated, they would like to see that the skill that comes out of the university are immediately usable. Now, university often produce students or graduates that's not necessarily directly employable. They are producing people that critical thinkers, that can create, that can communicate. And therefore there need to be some time where the private sector and the higher education sector needs to work together to say, well, how can we jointly increase the employability part? But I think if you want to be smart with a loan scheme system, and we didn't elaborate in this particular opinion piece on that, you could actually say, to what extent do you have a loan scheme system that is much more closer linked to the demands of the economy?
Right.
So there might be certain skills and programs that this loan scheme does not fund. And to say, well, there is just too many and they're not actually adding value, so to speak, to the economy, although I would argue that any graduate can add value, whether he's an entrepreneur or for the formal economy or working for a company.
Right.
But nevertheless, you could introduce to say, well, this loan scheme are going to be utilized to be able to bring us back to where the demand in the economy is to what the higher education sector produce. And secondly, Tumelo, it also can try to also address a challenge which I think hasn't been addressed appropriately, is to say that the split in higher education or post-school education, where you have universities, University of Technologies,
right,
and also TVET colleges. To what extent do you make sure that the distribution of people or students that study at those institutions are actually aligned with the economy? And we haven't got that right. A lot of people,
right,
specifically through NSFAS system, are more skewed to the university, and the TVET colleges is actually not getting the number of students what they should get to be able to address the vocational requirements that's in the economy.
Well, you know, Prof, I wish we had more time to explore this opinion piece. Definitely insights for both private and public to consider. But thank you so much for your time this morning, Professor Francis Petersen from the University of the Free State.